Snow hushes New York as a humble seamstress lifts her eyes and finds the city's coldest banker at her door. He brings a single request, a wedding gown for the daughter who will not forgive him. Silk unfurls, secrets stir. In the lamplight, a quiet bargain is struck, and a buried past slips its hand into the present. What begins as duty quivers into dangerous tenderness. What price will be paid when truth and desire pull the same thread? Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from, and answer this. What do you love most about period romances, the heartbreak or the hope? Your voice sets the stage. Now come closer. The first stitch is about to be sewn. New York City, December of the year 1899. The wind carried whispers through the alleys of the Lower East Side, curling between brick tenements and rattling loose shutters like secrets trying to break free. Snow clung to the cobblestones, softening the clamor of horse hooves and carriage wheels just blocks away, where the city's pulse throbbed beneath electric lights and opulent facades. But here, in the hush of Orchard Street, a different kind of life persisted, quieter, poorer, and far more enduring. Inside a narrow storefront dimly lit by gaslight and winter's pallor, Isadora Flynn bent over her sewing table with the concentration of a woman who had long ago learned that beauty could be born from discipline. The room smelled of starch, paraffin wax, and old wood. Bolts of fabric lined the walls like loyal sentinels, while spools of thread sat in orderly rows, waiting for a purpose. Her fingers, slender, calloused, precise, moved rhythmically through a length of satin that had been gifted by a retiring dressmaker. It was far too fine for any of her clients, but she stitched it anyway, if only to remember how it felt to work with softness. At 41, Isadora wore her years with grace, though few noticed. Her hair, dark brown streaked with silver, was always pinned into a modest bun. Her cheeks hollowed slightly by time and quiet restraint. She did not complain of the chill that seeped through the windows, nor of the stiffness in her joints after hours at the needle. Her life had not allowed such indulgences, and yet there was a calm dignity in the way she moved, a woman not untouched by sorrow, but unbroken by it. She had just set aside her embroidery hoop when the bell above the door chimed, its delicate ring slicing through the stillness like a blade. Visitors were rare this late in the afternoon, and clients even rarer. She wiped her hands on the linen apron she always wore and turned toward the door, expecting one of the neighborhood girls needing a hem adjusted for church. Instead, he stood there, tall, imposing, out of place. A man whose silhouette was more suited to the marble halls of Union Square banks than to the worn wooden floor of a working seamstress's shop. He held his hat in one gloved hand, the other resting lightly on the brass knob of his cane, though it was clear he did not need it for balance. It was habit or affectation, or perhaps both. "Miss Flynn?" His voice, though low, carried the weight of practiced authority, worn now at the edges. There was something old-fashioned in the way he said her name, something that made the room feel even smaller. She nodded slowly, eyes narrowing as they took him in. His coat was finely cut but not new. The cashmere had faded at the collar, and his black cravat bore the faint creases of reuse. His face was not one she recognized, though there was a familiarity in the lines of it, the kind etched by newspapers, by power, and by downfall. "Yes," she answered, careful not to invite more than the word offered. "May I help you, sir? I was told you are discreet and precise." His tone was not unkind, but neither was it warm. Isadora stiffened slightly. "I try to be." He stepped further into the room, and for the first time she noticed the snow clinging to his coat sleeves, the damp at the hem of his trousers. He had walked. From where, and why? "I require a dress," he said. "A wedding gown." That caught her. Isadora blinked, unsure she had heard him correctly. She gestured toward the stool near the wall. "Please sit. You've had quite a walk." He hesitated, then lowered himself slowly onto the wooden seat, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. She watched him, noting the strain in his eyes, not of exhaustion, but of effort, the effort it took to be polite, to appear in control, to speak of lace and ribbon when he clearly preferred ledgers and silence. "For whom?" she asked. He looked past her, toward the dusty mannequins in the back, toward the half-finished dresses and worn muslin forms. "My daughter." There it was, a flicker, a tremor beneath the surface of his voice. Regret, perhaps, or longing too old to name. "She is to be married?" Isadora asked gently. He nodded once. "Soon. And she wishes for you to commission her gown?" The silence that followed was cold, like the frost spreading across her window pane. "No," he said finally. "She does not wish it, but I do." There was no self-pity in his voice, no plea, only fact. Isadora felt something shift in her chest, not sympathy, not yet, but awareness. The man who sat before her had not come from luxury or leisure. He had come from grief. "I'll need measurements," she said carefully, "and to speak with her directly." "You will not," he replied too quickly. "She will not come." A pause. Then, softer, as if he hated needing to explain, "She no longer lives with me. She no longer speaks to me." He removed an envelope from inside his coat. Inside were sketches, surprisingly delicate, and a note in feminine script. Isadora read silently, her brows lifting. The bride was real. The wedding was real. But the commission was not hers. "You wish to make peace through thread," Isadora said, not accusingly. "I wish only," he replied, "to give her something beautiful before she disappears from my life entirely." The truth of that, its ache, its inevitability, settled into the space between them. She considered him now not as a stranger, but as a man grasping for something slipping too quickly through his hands. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." For a moment, Nathaniel Greer said nothing. Then he rose, placed the envelope gently on the counter and inclined his head. It was not gratitude, not exactly. It was something quieter, the acknowledgement of a contract between two people who had nothing left to trade but dignity. As he turned to leave, Isadora noticed the faint tremor in his left hand as he reached for the door. Outside, the snow had begun to fall more heavily, coating the city in forgetfulness. Inside, she touched the envelope again. She did not yet understand why her hands trembled, only that something had shifted, and she knew, with a seamstress's instinct, that once a thread is pulled, it cannot be pushed back into place. It must be followed to its end. The snow did not let up in the days that followed. It blanketed New York City in a hushed silver veil, muffling the sharp edges of its restless streets. In the Lower East Side, smoke curled lazily from crooked chimneys, and the air smelled of coal and roasted chestnuts. The city, in its finest December coat, pretended for a moment that it was softer than it truly was. But in the small seamstress shop, tucked between a cobbler's stall and a shuttered bakery, the chill came from within. Isadora Flynn had kept her fingers busy. She worked by lamplight each evening, the dull ache in her joints ignored, her stitches even and deliberate. On the worn wooden table before her, a bolt of ivory satin lay pinned and cut, the beginnings of a bodice taking form. Every fold was symmetrical, every hem pressed with care. And yet, despite the precision of her craft, there was a stiffness to her movements, a carefulness born not from focus, but from something unspoken. Each time she touched the fabric, she thought of him. Nathaniel Greer had returned precisely 3 days after their first meeting, at the hour he had said he would. Not a minute late, not a second early. He stepped into her shop as though stepping into a courtroom, composed, watchful, unreadable. "Good afternoon, Miss Flynn," he had said with a nod. "Mr. Greer," she answered, rising from her stool. There had been no pleasantries beyond that, no comment on the weather or the holiday crowds gathering uptown. He removed his gloves with mechanical precision and stood before her with the rigid patience of a man unaccustomed to waiting, yet determined to do so with dignity. She had taken his measurements with quiet professionalism, their proximity marked by a silence that pressed in from every direction. As she moved around him with her measuring tape, her fingers brushing his wrist, then his shoulder, then the hollow of his back, Isadora became acutely aware of the tension that hummed just beneath the surface of his skin. He did not flinch, nor speak, but his breath hitched almost imperceptibly when her hand grazed the edge of his collar. She did not ask him questions. He did not offer answers. And so it began. A rhythm of visits, always brief, always the same. Every third day, Nathaniel Greer would appear in her shop. He would remain no longer than necessary, his voice low, his gaze sharp, his words chosen with surgical care. He never lingered, never smiled, never asked about her work or her life, or even the progress of the dress beyond what was strictly required. But he watched, not her hands, nor her sewing. He watched her, quietly, steadily, as if memorizing the lines of her face and the cadence of her silence. She felt it, the weight of his gaze, and though she kept her posture firm, her eyes lowered. Something about his presence unsettled her. Not out of fear, there was nothing threatening in him, but out of the strange sense that he was both present and absent at once, like a shadow that remembered how to be a man. On the fifth visit, he arrived holding a slim envelope, which he placed on her table without explanation. "These are additional sketches," he said, "from her childhood, mostly. I thought they might guide you." His voice cracked slightly on that last word, only slightly. But Isadora, who had learned to read people the way one reads fabric, by tension, by weave, by hidden fault lines, did not miss it. She waited until he left before opening the envelope. Inside were pencil drawings on thick ivory paper. A girl in braids sitting beside a piano. A young woman with a bouquet in hand. A half-finished portrait of a delicate collar, trimmed in lace. The sketches were exquisite, tender even, and the signature in the corner of each one matched the man who had just walked out her door. He drew her dresses, Isadora thought, stunned. He remembered them. That night, she lit a second lamp and stayed up well past midnight, her eyes lingering too long on the curve of a neckline she hadn't sewn yet. It was the next morning, when she was sweeping near the stool he usually sat on, that she found the crumpled sheet of newsprint. It had fallen perhaps from his coat pocket, a single column from the Evening Telegram, dated nearly 2 years prior. The headline read, "Banking Scandal Tied to Unsafe Tenement Conditions. Names Emerge Amidst Public Outrage." She read the article once, then again. The words were cold, detached, yet their meaning struck like a match to dry kindling. Mr. Nathaniel Greer, of Greer and Kessler Investments, confirmed financier of multiple Lower Manhattan holdings, now under investigation for violations of safety code and tenant abuse. Her breath stopped. She saw the name of the street. She saw the name of the building. And then, impossibly, she saw her brother's handwriting in her mind. His last letter, scrawled in pencil on butcher paper, telling her he had found a room with a stove and a proper window. It was the last place he ever lived. The building caught fire that winter. The windows had been nailed shut. Isadora sat down slowly, the broom slipping from her fingers. Could it be coincidence? Perhaps. There were many financiers, many landlords, many tragedies. But the sharpness in her chest did not feel like coincidence. It felt like something buried, clawing its way to the surface. The next time Nathaniel came, she did not greet him right away. She let him stand by the door for a moment longer than usual. Let the silence fill the space where politeness once lived. When she did speak, her voice was cooler than before. "I'll need a better sense of her shoulders. She seems narrow in the sketches, but wide across the back in the measurements." He looked at her for a long second. "She used to carry violins," he murmured. Isadora blinked. "Excuse me?" She was meant to play. Her mother insisted on it. She carried the case to school every day, refused to let the driver do it for her. A pause. Then, "She was narrow when she was little. But she's strong now, that's all I meant. And just like that, the frost in Isadora's tone melted against her will. She marked the measurements down in silence, noting how he kept his gaze on the chalk lines on the floor, as if afraid that if he met her eyes, something would give way, something neither of them could take back. When he left, she did not ask him if he had forgotten anything. She did not mention the newspaper tucked under a stack of muslin, nor did she ask about the tenement, about Samuel, not yet. But that night, as she stitched a row of pearl buttons down the ghost of a bodice, her hands trembled, not from cold, but from a question she could no longer silence. Why her? Why now? And what, in the ruins of Nathaniel Greer's past, had brought him to her door at the edge of winter, asking not for forgiveness, but for beauty? The townhouse on Gramercy Park stood as a solemn monument to a man the city had chosen to forget. Its facade, once the colour of warm limestone, was now stained with the soot of 1,000 winters, the ornate cornices dulled by rain and time. Curtains no longer danced in the windows. No servant's footsteps echoed on the stone steps. No carriage stood waiting by the curb. The street had grown too used to the silence behind those doors. Inside, the air was still, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Nathaniel Greer stood at the window of what had once been his wife's music room. The mahogany floors creaked beneath his weight, the fire in the hearth barely more than embers. Outside, a thin sheet of frost clung to the black iron fence that enclosed the private square, but he did not shiver. His body had grown accustomed to the chill. It was the heat of things that unnerved him now, heat from memory, from shame, from longing too long suppressed. He sipped his tea cold. No one was left to warm it. No one was left at all. The house had once been a place of laughter and music, Miriam's music. He could still hear her in the quiet if he stayed still long enough, the gentle trill of her voice humming through the corridor as she moved from room to room with a shawl draped over her shoulders and her hair always slightly undone by the afternoon breeze. She had died in the upstairs chamber during a late winter, wrapped in blankets and burning with fever. Pneumonia, they had said. But Nathaniel knew better. She died because he had not sent for the doctor soon enough. Because he had been in meetings about iron, about bonds, about numbers that now meant nothing. She had called for him twice, only twice. And still he had missed it. His daughter had been 17 at the time, Constance. He closed his eyes. Her name did not come easily to his mouth anymore. It had grown heavy with guilt. After Miriam's death, Constance had packed her bags in silence. She had not wept in front of him. She had not raged. She had simply removed herself, like a fragile item from a crumbling shelf, and vanished into the world with the quiet elegance of her mother's ghost. He had not stopped her. What could he have offered? He who had never truly known how to hold a child, how to soften his voice, how to be gentle. He who had built empires of steel and smoke, yet could not build a bridge to the one soul who needed him to be something other than a man of ledgers. He wandered the house now like a visitor. The staff had departed long ago. One by one, they left as the money drained from the accounts, as the halls grew colder, the larder emptier. He had dismissed them with as much grace as he could, paying what he had left, refusing charity from former colleagues who whispered about his fall behind brandy glasses and oil paintings. He did not beg. He never would. But pride was not the shield it had once been. Pride did not change the fact that he now cooked his own tea, cleaned his own coats, mended the fraying sleeves of his once golden wardrobe with thread borrowed from a tailor down the street. The banker, who had once spoken before Congress about economic stabilization, now buttoned his waistcoat in the morning with hands that shook. The fire popped, and he turned from the window. On the mantel stood a small collection of artifacts from a life that no longer belonged to him. A miniature ivory fan Miriam had carried on their wedding day, a silver case of violin rosin Constance had used during her first recital, and a portrait, unfinished, of the three of them in a sun-drenched garden that no longer existed. The artist had never returned to complete it. Neither had Constance. He had received word through a mutual acquaintance that she was to be married in the spring. To a man of little fortune but great moral character, apparently. The irony had not escaped him. He had once forbidden her from associating with a clerk, deeming him unsuitable. Now she would marry one, and she would do so without him. Unless... His fingers brushed the edge of the envelope on the side table, the same envelope he had handed to the seamstress. Miss Flynn, Isadora. There was something about her that had disturbed his balance, though she had done nothing to provoke it. A quiet woman, steady hands, a face that revealed more than she intended, especially when she thought no one was watching. He had known from the first moment that she would not look at him the way others once had, with fear or reverence or envy. She looked at him as though she saw something human. It was intolerable. And yet he returned to her again and again, letting her pin fabric to his chest, letting her fingers touch the hollow beneath his collarbone as she measured, letting her silence speak louder than any question she might dare to ask. He had left the newspaper by accident, or perhaps he had not. Perhaps some part of him wanted her to know, to uncover the truth herself and make of it what she wished. She would not pity him. Of that he was certain. There was no pity in the way she looked at anyone, only judgment and something gentler beneath it, something far more dangerous. He walked slowly into the hallway and climbed the staircase, each step creaking like a confession. Upstairs, in Miriam's old room, the curtains had been drawn for years. Dust coated the edges of the mirror. The bed had not been made since the day he lost her. He sat at the edge now, his hands clasped together, elbows on knees. The weight of everything rested between his shoulder blades, the weight of silence, of regret, of years squandered in pursuit of what no longer mattered. He remembered a night long ago when Constance had been just a child. She had fallen ill, feverish, frightened. Miriam had sat by her bedside, singing lullabies in French. Nathaniel had stood at the doorway, too afraid to intrude. His daughter had reached for him, and he had turned away. Told himself it was best to let Miriam handle it, that his presence would only complicate things. It was the first time he had failed her. It would not be the last. He rose now, moving to the desk where Miriam used to write letters with rose-colored ink. He opened the drawer. There were still sheets of stationery inside, the scent of lavender long faded. He took a page and a pen and began to write. To Constance, not to beg, not to explain, only to say what should have been said long ago. By the time he finished, his hand was sore and the ink had blotted the corner of the page. He folded it carefully and sealed it with wax. Then he took another sheet and began a second letter, this one for Isadora Flynn. She had agreed to sew the dress, yes, but she had agreed without knowing the whole truth, and if she was to be part of this last, fragile offering he intended for his daughter, then she deserved at least a glimpse of the man behind the commission. Not the banker, not the scandal, not the ruin, but the father, the widower, the man without a future. He would tell her nothing more than what was necessary, but he would place it in her hands, along with the silk and the lace and the buttons that once adorned Miriam's wedding gloves. And if she looked at him differently afterward, if she chose to turn away, it would be no more than he deserved. He left the letters on the desk and returned to the window just as the lamps began to glow along Gramercy Park. The snow had started again, and the city, his city, moved on without him. The gaslight flickered gently against the windows of Isadora's modest workshop, casting wavering shadows on bolts of fabric and baskets of thread. Outside, the snow had ceased for the first time in days, leaving behind streets glazed in brittle ice and an eerie, quiet calm. The city held its breath beneath a blanket of grey, and inside her shop, Isadora Flynn stitched in silence. It was late in the afternoon when he arrived. Nathaniel Greer's footsteps were always the same, measured, deliberate, almost reluctant. as if each step toward her door cost him something. He removed his hat before entering, his overcoat still dusted with melting snow, his gloves clutched in one hand. As always, his eyes met hers with that same unwavering calm. Yet behind it lingered something else. A tremor, not of the body but of the soul. "Miss Flynn," he greeted with a nod. "Mr. Greer," she returned, setting aside her needlework. They stood for a moment in the quiet, the only sound coming from the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional pop of wood in the small iron stove near her work table. The air between them felt different that day, less rigid, less cold. Isadora noticed a faint weariness around his mouth, the kind that no sleep could erase. Perhaps it was the weather or the heaviness of the weeks past, but she found herself doing something she had not done with him before. "Would you care for a cup of tea?" she asked. Nathaniel blinked once, surprised, not by the offer, but by the softness in her voice. "I would," he said after a breath, "if it's not too much trouble." She nodded and disappeared into the back room. The tea was simple, a blend of dried orange peel and cloves she'd bartered from the apothecary. When she returned, she found him not at his usual place by the door, but standing near the sewing table, his gaze resting on the nearly completed bodice of the gown. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. She did not respond at first. Praise from him unsettled her, as though his words carried a weight she wasn't prepared to hold. She poured the tea into 2 mismatched cups and handed him one, watching as his gloved fingers brushed against hers. That single touch, fleeting and unintentional, sent a shiver through her chest. They sat in silence for several minutes. He on the stool beneath the window, she on the edge of her workbench. Outside, the frost clung stubbornly to the glass, distorting the view of the world beyond. Inside, the steam from their cups rose in slow spirals between them. "It must feel strange," she said eventually, "to see a dress made for someone who will not wear it in your presence." Nathaniel did not flinch. "It is not the first time I've prepared something for someone who would not receive it." Isadora looked down at her tea, the amber liquid trembling slightly in the porcelain. "I lost my brother to fire," she said, her voice nearly a whisper. "Samuel. He was 17. Nathaniel's head turned toward her, the motion slow and deliberate. But he said nothing. It was in a tenement near the docks. The windows had been sealed shut. The landlord had promised repairs. None came. She paused, her fingers curling tighter around her cup. The building was owned by a company named Greer and Kessler. The name hung in the air between them like the tolling of a bell. She did not accuse, she did not demand. She merely said the words, her tone void of bitterness, as though she had long ago buried the anger and now only held the ache. But her eyes, those clear, intelligent eyes, watched him closely, searching for any flicker of truth. Nathaniel lowered his gaze. "I know the name," he murmured. "Most people do," she replied. A long silence passed. The stove crackled. A delivery cart rattled by on the street. "I do not know if it was coincidence," she said gently, "or fate, but it is difficult to sit across from that name and not wonder why you came here. Why now?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but his eyes did not rise to meet hers. "I came because I have nothing left to give but this," he said, "because everything I built turned to ash. And because I wronged people I will never be able to face." Her breath caught in her throat. "But you face me." He looked up then, and for the first time since they'd met, the wall in his eyes cracked. Just enough. "You are the first person who has looked at me without pretending not to know who I was, or who I still am." "I don't know who you are, Mr. Greer," she said almost kindly. "Only what you carry." And in that moment, something passed between them, something tender and dangerous. The kind of understanding that does not need words, that lives in the marrow of shared silence. He placed his cup on the windowsill and stood. "I should go." She nodded, though a part of her wanted to ask him to stay, not for conversation, not for warmth, but simply so that the silence would not return. As he turned toward the door, he paused. "Samuel," he said softly. "What was he like?" Isadora blinked. "He was foolish," she said with a sad smile. "Brave. Always breaking things to see how they worked. He wanted to be a clockmaker. He used to take apart our alarm bell just to fix it again." Nathaniel allowed himself a faint smile, barely there, but real. "He sounds like someone who didn't belong in this world," he said. She nodded once. "No," she whispered. "He didn't." He opened the door then, letting in a gust of cold air that brushed across her skin like a forgotten breath. "Thank you for the tea," he said without looking back. And then he was gone. The bell above the door chimed once, and silence reclaimed the room. Isadora sat still for a long time. The tea had gone cold in her cup, but her hands remained wrapped around it, as though it might still offer warmth. She stared at the gown on her table. It was nearly complete now, the bodice shaped to the sketches he had given her, the seams perfect, the lace delicate and precise. But she saw it differently now, not as a gift, not even as a commission, but as a confession in silk. A man had entered her life asking for a dress. What he truly sought was forgiveness he dared not name. And as she reached for her needle once more, her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the knowledge that her hands were no longer sewing for a stranger. They were sewing for a man who carried ghosts like she did. And with every stitch, she bound his grief to hers, thread by silent, fragile thread. The sky over Gramercy Park was a sombre slate when Isadora arrived, the clouds heavy with the threat of snow. Her gloved hands clutched a fabric-covered box against her chest, the contents carefully arranged, ivory silk samples, a length of chantilly lace, and her final pattern for the wedding gown's sleeves. She had dressed plainly, as always, but with a touch more care, her charcoal wool coat freshly brushed, her boots polished, her hair pinned into a smooth coil at the nape of her neck. She had never crossed the threshold of a home like this before, a grand townhouse with wrought-iron railings, gas lamps flanking the stone steps, and a silence that seemed deeper than any poverty she had known. The door opened before she could knock. Nathaniel stood there in his usual dark suit, the lines of his coat impeccable despite the fatigue around his eyes. He did not smile, but his expression softened when he saw her. "Miss Flynn," he said simply. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, and he stepped aside. The entrance hall swallowed her in quiet shadow. The marble floor, though worn at the edges, still gleamed under the muted light of a single chandelier. A staircase rose on the left, its carved balustrade untouched by dust. Everything was immaculate and yet hollow, like a museum of a life that had ended, though its inhabitants still walked within it. "This way, please," Nathaniel murmured, leading her down a corridor lined with faded portraits and closed doors. At the end, a drawing room opened, its tall windows framed by velvet drapes and a fire crackling softly in the hearth. Isadora moved with silent precision, setting her box on the edge of a chaise. Her eyes wandered briefly over the room, the empty decanter on the sideboard, the unplayed piano, the bookshelves that had not been touched in years. "I'll fetch her," Nathaniel said, his voice low. Isadora turned. "She's here. She arrived yesterday." He paused. "Without notice. She's upstairs." There was something hesitant in his tone, as though even the mere act of informing her stirred unease. He left without another word, and Isadora remained still, her eyes on the fire. She pressed her hands together to calm them. This visit was supposed to be about fit, fabric, final adjustments, but she already sensed the air held something else. Footsteps returned, 2 sets, and then she entered. Constance Greer was a vision that belonged to another world. She appeared in the doorway as if conjured by memory, tall, elegant, unmistakably her father's daughter in frame and bearing, yet wholly unlike him in expression. She was dressed in a dove-grey day gown, trimmed in satin, her hair pinned in loose waves that framed a face both striking and severe. Her eyes, a colder shade of blue than Nathaniel's, swept over Isadora with immediate and unapologetic scrutiny. "So," she said, stepping further into the room. "You're the one sewing the dress." Isadora inclined her head. "Miss Greer." Constance gave a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "You'll have to forgive me. I hadn't imagined the woman who would stitch me into my father's guilt would be quite so unassuming." Nathaniel stiffened behind her but said nothing. Isadora, though taken aback, remained composed. "I was told the gown was for your wedding, nothing more. And yet you came." "I did." Constance walked past her toward the window, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of the curtain. "This house has not known a woman's touch in years. I imagine my father thought it poetic to fill it with the sound of needles again." "Constance," Nathaniel said, his voice strained. She turned on him. "Don't. You brought her here. You brought me here. Let us all be honest, if nothing else." Isadora remained quiet, letting the scene unfold, as though watching a play she had never auditioned for. Constance moved toward the box and lifted the lace, holding it between her fingers. "It's lovely," she said. "Delicate, painstakingly made, just like this entire charade." "It's not a charade," Nathaniel said. "It's a gift, a gesture." "A gesture," she repeated, laughing softly. "Isn't it curious how you've suddenly become so fond of gestures? Where were they when I turned 18? When I buried my mother alone? When you told me that grief made me weak?" Nathaniel's silence was worse than any defense. Isadora looked away. Constance dropped the lace and sat on the chaise. "Do you have your measurements?" "I do," Isadora said. "Then let us proceed quickly. I won't be here long." Isadora knelt beside her, her hands steady despite the ice in the air. She placed the measuring tape around Constance's shoulders, noting the way her posture was flawless. Not a single inch of her body slouched or sagged. She was composed entirely of armor. As Isadora moved to the sleeves, her fingers brushed Constance's wrist. The young woman flinched. "Cold hands," she murmured. "Apologies." Constance's eyes flicked toward her. "You're not from his world. That's why you agreed to this. You don't understand what it means." "I understand regret," Isadora said softly, "and grief." Constance's expression faltered for a moment, then hardened again. "Grief is for the sentimental. I prefer clarity." Isadora stood slowly. "And what is this dress to you, then?" Constance rose too, her voice quiet. "A shroud." She turned to her father. "I'll be leaving tonight. Don't send anything else after me. The dress may arrive with the others." Nathaniel stepped forward. "Please." But she raised a hand. "No. I agreed to the fitting, that was all." Then, without another word, she walked out, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The silence she left behind was immense. Isadora stared at the fire again, her heart pounding. The gown felt heavier now, not silk, but stone. "She's angry," Nathaniel said finally. "And she has every right to be." Isadora looked at him. "She's not angry, Mr. Greer. She's wounded, and wounds do not close with lace." He nodded slowly, then crossed to the writing desk in the corner of the room. He opened the drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope. "This is for the children's home," he said, holding it out. "I've made arrangements, quietly, under Samuel's name." Isadora did not take it. Her hands remained at her sides. "Does she know?" He hesitated. "No, not yet. I wanted to wait, until the dress was done, until I found the words." Isadora met his gaze, and something in her expression shifted. It was not forgiveness. But it was not refusal. "I hope you find them," she said. She gathered her box and stepped toward the door. He followed, his silence deeper than before. Outside, the sky had begun to darken. As she descended the stone steps of the townhouse, she paused once to look back. He stood at the window, his hand resting on the glass. He did not wave. He did not speak. But their eyes met, and in that gaze was everything neither of them could say aloud. That she had seen too much. That he had said too little. That somewhere between silk and sorrow, a thread had been pulled too tightly to ignore, and it would not let go. The days following the encounter with Constance Greer passed in a haze of cold air and unspoken unrest. Snow returned to the streets of New York in thick, windless flurries, covering rooftops and window panes in a blanket of quiet that belied the turmoil simmering beneath Isadora's composed surface. Inside her workshop, the warmth of the iron stove no longer reached her bones. The fire burned, but something inside her had gone still. She kept herself busy. That was the safest course. The gown was nearly finished now, the hem stitched by hand, each pearl button secured with invisible thread. She trimmed the sleeves with a scalloped lace no wider than a ribbon, the kind of detail only a bride or a mother might notice, but neither had spoken to her since that afternoon in the townhouse. The memory lingered like the scent of extinguished candle wax, sharp, haunting, unresolved. Nathaniel had not come again, and Isadora found that she had begun to miss the sound of his voice, the quiet steadiness of it, the way he looked at her as though words were too crude for what passed between them. She missed his stillness, even, and the weight of his presence as he stood beside her work table, neither speaking nor demanding, simply there. She had grown used to that presence, too used to it, and that frightened her. She told herself it was dangerous to feel, dangerous to hope. Her place was behind the needle, not at the center of anyone's heart. She was a seamstress, not a savior. But even so, when the knock came on her door just after dusk, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Nathaniel, it was a boy, barely 12. "Are you Miss Flynn?" he asked, eyes wide beneath a threadbare cap. "They told me to come. Mr. Greer, he's sick. He fell outside his house. Mr. Feldman next door says you're the only one who might help." Isadora did not speak. She grabbed her coat, her scarf, her gloves, and followed the boy into the freezing dark. Gramercy Park was quiet beneath the snow. Gas lamps flickered along the avenue, their glow muted by the storm. Nathaniel's townhouse loomed in the distance, the curtains drawn, the door ajar. The boy vanished down the street as she climbed the steps 2 at a time, her breath clouding before her. She found him just inside the threshold. He lay sprawled on the marble floor of the foyer, half-conscious, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him. Snow clung to his coat and shoes, melting in slow rivulets beneath his body. His face was pale, and a feverish flush burned high on his cheeks. "Nathaniel," she said, kneeling beside him, her voice tight. His eyelids fluttered. His lips moved, but no sound came. She placed a hand against his forehead. Too hot, too fast. The house was freezing. She stood and closed the door, shutting out the wind, then returned to him. With great effort, she slipped her arms beneath his shoulders and heaved him upright. He stirred, groaned, then slumped against her. "You're not allowed to leave me like this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Not like this." She dragged him step by step into the drawing room. The fire had long since gone cold. She laid him on the chaise, pulled off his coat, and rushed to find kindling. She worked quickly, feeding the embers until flames sparked anew. The warmth crept back into the room slowly, like a long-forgotten memory. Nathaniel remained motionless, save for the twitch of his fingers and the shallow rise and fall of his chest. She found a damp towel and pressed it to his brow, then another, then another. Time slowed to a crawl. She removed her gloves and sat beside him, candlelight dancing over the tired lines of his face. He looked older this way, vulnerable in a way she had never seen him. His features had always seemed carved in stone, but now they softened in sleep, the sharpness dulled by fever and fatigue. She sewed through the night, not out of obligation, but out of need. The gown lay beside her in its final stage, all but finished. The hem was undone, the veil untrimmed. She worked quietly, the rhythm of her stitches grounding her as she watched over him. Every so often she would pause to check his forehead, to replace the cloth, to whisper words he would not remember. "You shouldn't be alone," she said at one point, her voice breaking. "Not now, not anymore." Near midnight, he stirred. His eyelids opened just enough to find her. "Isadora," he rasped. Her name on his lips, broken, breathless, was unlike anything she had ever heard. "I'm here," she said. He blinked slowly. Then, as if in a dream, he reached for her hand. She hesitated for only a moment, then let him take it. His fingers, though weak, closed around hers with startling tenderness. A tremor passed through her chest. Not fear, not sorrow, but something far more dangerous. She felt it in the press of skin to skin, in the heat of his palm, in the silence that wrapped around them like a woolen shawl. He did not speak again. His grip slackened, and sleep claimed him once more. But he did not let go, and she did not pull away. Outside, the snow fell heavier, muffling the world into stillness. Inside, the fire glowed with renewed life, casting soft shadows over the room. The dress remained at her side, half-veiled in candlelight, waiting to be finished. But Isadora did not move. She sat with his hand in hers, her thumb brushing lightly over the back of it, her heart aching with a tenderness she had spent a lifetime denying. This was not love, not yet, but it was its beginning. And beginnings, like the first crocus breaking through frost, were fragile, easily crushed, easily lost. But in that hour, in that warmth, in that room full of ghosts and ash and quiet hope, something small and real began to bloom. The city stirred beneath a thin layer of snow, its usual cacophony softened by winter's hush. Carriages moved cautiously along icy cobblestones, and plumes of smoke unfurled from chimney tops like ghostly fingers reaching into the overcast sky. But within the confines of a law office on the corner of Fifth Avenue and East 22nd, the cold came not from weather, but from revelation. Isadora Flynn stood at the polished counter, her gloves clutched tightly in one hand. The clerk, a young man with spectacles and ink-stained cuffs, had just returned from the back room, holding a folded document and a narrow envelope sealed with red wax. "Mr. Greer instructed us to issue final payment upon confirmation that the work was nearly complete," he said, offering the papers with formal courtesy. "The funds are drawn from a private account. All is in order." She nodded, accepting the envelope without a word. But as the clerk turned away, something on the open ledger caught her eye. A line of writing near the bottom of the page, carelessly exposed. A deed, a property, the name of the slum where Samuel had died. Her breath stopped. She stepped closer, fingers tightening on the edge of the counter. Her eyes scanned the line again, and there, printed in stark black ink beside the block and lot number, was the name. Greer and Kessler Investments, and below it, in unmistakable cursive, the signature, Nathaniel Greer. Time fractured. She no longer heard the creak of the door as a client entered, no longer saw the dust motes floating through the sunlit air. All she could see was Samuel's face, his grin, his soot-streaked cheeks, the letter he had written days before the fire, folded beneath her pillow for years. She had told herself it was coincidence. A shared name, a cruel trick of fate. But it wasn't. It was him. Her throat closed, the edges of her vision blurring. Somehow she managed a stiff nod and left the office without another word. Outside, the cold slapped her cheeks, but she did not feel it. She walked with no direction at first, weaving through the crowd as though sleepwalking. Her thoughts tangled like thread unraveled too quickly, too violently. She clutched the envelope against her chest, her boots crunching over frozen puddles as the weight of the truth settled over her shoulders like a wet wool coat. He had known. From the beginning. Nathaniel Greer had walked into her shop with full knowledge of what he had taken from her. He had watched her stitch lace with the same fingers that had once buried her brother. He had accepted her kindness, her silence, her care, and never once said a word. The betrayal cut deeper than she could explain. It was not merely the act, the signing of a paper or the financing of a building. It was the silence, the way he had allowed her to soften toward him, to see in him something redeemable, something human. She had tended him in his fever, sat beside him as he slept, let him hold her hand in the stillness of night, and all the while the truth had been waiting beneath the silk. That evening, She returned to her workshop. The gown sat on the mannequin, its bodice gleaming like snow in the lamplight, the lace veil pinned into place with quiet dignity. It was finished now, every seam, every fold, every whisper of thread, her finest work, and the last she would ever make for him. She packed it with meticulous care, not out of sentiment that had died on the steps of the lawyer's office, but out of duty. She would not leave the gown unfinished. That, at least, she could control. The next morning, she made her way to Gramercy Park. She did not ring the bell. She left the parcel at the doorstep, wrapped in brown paper tied with cord. No note, no explanation, just silence. Then she turned and walked away. Days passed. The snow melted into slush, then refroze. She resumed her work, though her hands moved without joy. The dress forms stood untouched, the scissors dulled. She received clients, measured hems, stitched buttons, all with the quiet precision of a woman who had turned her heart to stone. She told herself it didn't matter, that it was finished, that she had been foolish to believe otherwise, until the letter arrived. It was late afternoon. A knock at the door, a courier with wind-chapped cheeks and a small envelope bearing no return address. Inside, a single page, his handwriting. Isadora. There are no justifications, only truths. I was the man who signed the deed. I was the man who built a fortune on the backs of families like yours. I was the man who ignored the cracks in the walls, who dismissed the warnings, who chose numbers over names. I was the man who killed your brother, not with fire, but with silence. When I came to you, I told myself it was coincidence, that you wouldn't remember, that you wouldn't know, but from the moment I saw your eyes, I understood I had been wrong. You saw me, and I let you, and worse still, I let you care for me. You sat by my side when I could not stand. You offered me tea when I deserved nothing. You gave me the softness I had spent a lifetime avoiding, and in return I gave you only omission. I cannot ask for your forgiveness. I have no right to it. But I can offer you the truth. The gown was never about Constance. It was never about marriage or reconciliation. It was a memorial, a monument in silk to the lives I could not bring back, to your brother, to your childhood, to everything I broke. And it was my final act of atonement, not because I deserve peace, but because you do. You, who have sown beauty into sorrow, who have stitched strength into ruin, who have lived with grace when the world gave you none. I will not write again. Whatever you choose now, it is yours alone. With humility, Nathaniel. She read it once, then again, then a third time, her fingers trembling as the ink blurred before her eyes. It was not a plea, it was not absolution, it was the truth, raw, unsparing, and offered without defense. And for the first time in weeks, she wept. Not for him, not even for Samuel, but for the girl she had once been, the one who had learned to mend broken things with thread and silence, but never with words. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beneath her sewing table. Then she returned to her workbench, her hands steady once more. And the silence, though still present, no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a door, barely ajar. The snow fell with a strange kind of grace that morning, slow, silent, and relentless, blanketing the city in a hush that softened even the sharpest corners of New York. By the time the sun had risen behind the clouds, Gramercy Park lay cloaked in white, its wrought-iron gates adorned with frost, the trees heavy with the weight of winter. In her small shop, Isadora stood by the window, the lace curtain pushed aside just enough to watch the flakes drift downward. The world, beyond the glass, felt suspended in time. The street was empty, the sounds muffled. The ticking of the clock above her work table had never felt so loud. The letter from Nathaniel remained in the drawer beside her sewing shears, its edges slightly curled, as though even the paper itself had been burdened by what it carried. She had not answered him. She hadn't known how. And though days had passed since it arrived, her heart still beat differently each time she thought of his words. She had told herself she would not go back, and she hadn't, until the knock came. It was late morning when the sound startled her, a sharp, urgent tap at the door that echoed through the workshop like a summons. She opened it slowly, half expecting a stranger, a client, or perhaps the postman with another forgotten bill. Instead, it was Constance Greer. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her boots dusted with snow, and her grey cloak hung open over a plum-coloured dress too fine for such weather. She looked nothing like the haughty woman who had once measured Isadora with scorn. Today, her expression held something unfamiliar. "Miss Flynn," she said, breath visible in the air. "May I come in?" Isadora stepped aside wordlessly. Inside, Constance moved to the hearth without waiting to be offered a seat. She stood close to the flames, removing her gloves slowly, as though her fingers had lost feeling. The silence between them stretched thin, held together only by the crackle of burning wood. "I know I'm not welcome here," she said finally, "and I wouldn't have come unless it was important." Isadora stood across from her, guarded, but not unkind. "I heard from my father," Constance continued. "He sent me a letter last week. No apologies, no explanations. Just a page and a document. A trust." She reached into her reticule and unfolded a sheet of paper, holding it out for Isadora to see. "It's in your brother's name, Samuel Flynn. A home for orphan children in the Lower East Side, with heating, sanitation, books, a woman to sing to them at night, and another to mend their clothes." Isadora stared at the paper without touching it. "He did that?" she asked quietly. Constance nodded. "He did. And you believe it was genuine?" "I do," Constance said. "I don't know what changed in him, but something did." Isadora's eyes dropped to the floor. "I think you changed him," Constance added, her voice softer now. "He wrote of you with a kind of reverence. It startled me." She turned, placing the paper on the table. "I wanted to hate you," she admitted. "It would have been easier to pretend you were just another woman taken in by his regrets. But you're not. You never were." The words landed like snowflakes, weightless, but cold against the skin. "Why tell me this?" Isadora asked. "Because I don't think he has much time left," Constance said, "and because I think he's still waiting for you." She left not long after, her boots leaving prints in the snow-covered street. Isadora stood at the door watching until the last glimpse of her cloak disappeared around the corner. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. That evening the wind grew stronger, sweeping across the rooftops like a whispering tide. The lamplighters moved through the city in heavy coats, their long poles igniting halos of gold against the dusk. And in a house near Gramercy Park, a man sat alone beside a fire that had burned down to coals. Nathaniel Greer's hands trembled as he lifted the cup of water to his lips. His breath was shallow, each inhale a labour. He had not eaten since morning. He had not spoken to anyone in days. And yet, he waited. Outside, the snow returned, heavier now, wet and clinging to every surface. He closed his eyes. Perhaps this was how it would end. But the knock at the door came before sleep could take him. It was gentle but certain. He stood slowly, leaning on the cane he hadn't needed in years, and made his way to the entrance. And there she was. Isadora Flynn, wrapped in her wool coat, her scarf flecked with snow, and her eyes, those warm, unyielding eyes, fixed on him with something between sorrow and resolve. "You're late," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're thinner," she replied. He stepped aside. She entered. The house was colder than she remembered, dustier, dimmer. But it did not matter. She found her way to the drawing room as though she had never left, setting her parcel on the table, removing her coat and kneeling beside the chaise without waiting for invitation. "I came to finish it," she said. "That's all." Nathaniel nodded. He sat nearby, his breath rattling faintly in his chest. He did not watch her work. He could not bear to. Instead, he stared at the fire, his hand resting lightly on the armrest until he felt something brush against it. Her hand, light as thread. He did not speak, nor did she. The gown lay across her lap, ivory silk, gleaming softly in the firelight, its veil cascading over the edge of the chair like a fall of snow. She trimmed the final hem, her fingers moving with reverence. Each stitch was careful, precise, and full of a silence that pulsed with meaning. The hours passed. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters. Inside, the only sound was the steady rhythm of her needle and the occasional crackle of wood. Sometime past midnight, she paused, setting the fabric aside. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Nathaniel turned to her, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Because I didn't want to lose what little kindness you offered me," he said, "and because I was ashamed." She nodded once, then resumed her sewing. And when her hand trembled, he reached for it, not with desperation, not with expectation, but with the humility of a man who had finally learned how to hold something without breaking it. And this time, she did not pull away. As dawn approached, the sky lightened into the palest grey, and the fire dimmed into quiet embers. The gown was complete, but Isadora remained, her head bowed near the flickering candle, his hand resting in hers. And the snow, relentless and soft, fell like forgiveness beyond the frozen glass. The morning arrived with a hush. Snow, soft and steady, blanketed New York in a fragile veil of white, as if the city itself understood the weight of what was to come. The carriages moved more slowly through the frost-laced avenues, their wheels muffled against cobblestone. Inside a modest brick chapel on the edge of Gramercy Park, the pews were filled with soft murmurs, the rustle of winter coats, and the faint scent of lilac water rising from fine gloves. Constance Greer stood before the tall mirror in the vestry, the last silk dress draped upon her with elegant solemnity. The gown, fitted with reverent precision, clung to her like memory. Ivory satin flowed from her waist to the floor, hemmed with hand-sewn stitches too delicate for the eye to follow. The bodice, high-necked with a row of small silk-covered buttons, shimmered faintly under the morning light filtering through stained glass. She did not smile. She did not weep. Her face, once tight with bitterness, was calm, composed. A quiet resignation had softened the lines around her eyes. This gown was not a gesture of forgiveness. It was a closing chapter. Nathaniel stood in the small antechamber beside the sanctuary, his cane resting against the bench, his gloved hands folded. His coat was of older wool, neatly brushed, though time had not spared it from fraying at the edges. His cravat was modest, his collar slightly loose. A streak of silver gleamed at his temples, more pronounced than ever, and beneath his eyes, hollows darkened his once imposing face. He looked not like a banker nor a fallen man. He looked like a father waiting to be seen. The chapel doors opened slowly, and Isadora entered without announcement. She wore a dove-grey cloak lined with pale wool, and a hat, modest in shape, veiled just enough to shield her eyes. In her gloved hands, she carried a carefully wrapped bundle, the final adjustments to the gown. Her steps, though steady, echoed with the weight of everything left unsaid. Constance turned as she entered, and for the briefest of moments, their eyes met. No words passed between them. The daughter of privilege and the seamstress of silence stood before each other, two women bearing the burden of a man's sorrow. Isadora lowered her gaze and handed the parcel to the maid. She offered a slight curtsy, more instinct than formality, and turned to leave, but a voice, soft and dry, halted her at the door. "Miss Flynn," Constance said. "It fits perfectly." Isadora paused, nodded once, and exited without another word. The sanctuary filled slowly. The ceremony, intended to be intimate, felt as though it held the city's breath. The Greer name still carried weight, even if tarnished. A string quartet played a subdued melody, the notes echoing faintly through the tall rafters. Candles flickered beneath garlands of winter ivy. From the very last pew, half-shadowed and nearly forgotten by the guests, Isadora sat with her gloved hands resting on her lap. Her presence was a whisper. She wore no jewels, no colours to catch the eye. Only the simplicity of her posture and the quiet in her gaze revealed the depth of her watching. When the bride entered, every head turned, but only one pair of eyes sought out the back of the room. Nathaniel saw her. He did not start. He did not rise, but something shifted in him, subtle and profound. The glimmer of recognition of something sacred passed between them across the crowded space. Their eyes met, not with longing nor pain, but with gratitude, quiet, complete. He turned back to his daughter and took her arm. Constance did not flinch. The ceremony began with the steady voice of the officiant, words of solemn union and promises spoken in soft tones. Isadora heard none of it. Her heart beat too loudly, her breath shallow in the folds of her throat. She watched not the bride and groom, but the way Nathaniel held himself beside his daughter. His posture still proud, though tempered with frailty, his eyes focused, no longer haunted. In that moment, she saw the man he had once been, and the man he had become, and though no smile touched her lips, a warmth bloomed inside her that no winter wind could touch. She remained only until the couple walked down the aisle, arm in arm, stepping into the new life waiting outside the chapel doors. As the guests began to stir and speak, as footsteps rustled and the quartet resumed a cheerful melody, Isadora stood and slipped out the side door, her footsteps lost in the hush of snow. She did not stay for the reception. She did not need to. Her presence had been enough. Later that evening, as twilight dipped the city in pale blue and gaslights flickered across the park, Nathaniel returned to his home. His steps were slower now, his cane more necessary than before. The townhouse stood as it always had, tall, quiet, tired, yet something waited for him inside. On the desk in the drawing room, where the fire still burned low, a letter rested, addressed in firm, precise handwriting. Folded beneath it, wrapped in linen, was a single silk thread. The letter was brief. She had written nothing about love, nor pain, nor regret. Only a few lines. I was never meant to interrupt your farewell. I was only meant to witness it. The gown is finished. The past is not. But what we shared was real. Let that be enough. The thread, the same silk she had used to stitch the final hem, gleamed faintly in the firelight. Nathaniel pressed the thread between his fingers. It was the smallest of things, and yet, in its simplicity, it held the weight of all that had passed between them. The silences, the glances, the tea and fevered nights, the ache and the healing. He closed his eyes. In another room, the last guests of the evening departed. Constance, now a bride, paused at the foot of the stairs. She looked once toward the drawing room, then climbed slowly to her chamber, her gown trailing behind her like a page of a story finally complete. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft, tireless, timeless, blanketing the city in white as the final hours of the century slipped away. And within the Greer house, where silence had once reigned in cold detachment, a single thread, left behind by a seamstress no longer invisible, gleamed like a line of memory sewn into the heart of something once broken, and now, perhaps, mended. The last day of the century arrived beneath a blanket of snow that had not ceased since dawn. New York, ever restless, had grown strangely quiet under the weight of its own anticipation. Carriages left twin trails along the avenues, and windows above the cobbled streets flickered with the soft glow of gaslight and oil lamps. Streamers fluttered from awnings in the more affluent neighborhoods. Along Fifth Avenue, laughter rose from behind silk curtains, but in the modest corners of the city, the day felt sacred, hushed, reflective, as though the city itself was holding its breath between two centuries. In her small apartment above the tailor's shop, Isadora Flynn stood at her window and watched the world exhale steam and memory into the brittle December air. Her sewing table, usually cluttered with work, sat empty. The last silk gown had been delivered. Her fingers, long calloused by years of thread and needle, rested still in her lap. She was dressed simply, a pale grey dress of fine wool, buttoned to the collarbone, and a shawl her mother had crocheted when she was a girl. Her hair, now streaked with silver at the temples, was pinned in a low, careful knot. No corset cinched her breath. No jewellery clung to her neck. And yet in her stillness she radiated something rare, the quiet dignity of a woman who had loved, been wounded, and survived. On the table beside her sat a small parcel, wrapped in fine parchment and sealed with wax. She had found it that morning on her doorstep, nestled in fresh snow. There had been no knock, no messenger, only the careful presence of a gift that bore no demand to be opened, only the silent invitation of its weight. Now, as fireworks began to burst faintly in the distance, first in the north, then along the Hudson, she broke the seal. Inside was a letter, the ink slightly faded but written in Nathaniel Greer's steady hand. There were no flourishes, no grand declarations, only this: I do not ask for forgiveness, only that you know I tried. I saw what I ruined. I saw what I could have become. This land was once promised to a factory. Now it belongs to you. May the hands that once mended my soul mend others still. With all that remains of me, Nathaniel. Beneath the letter lay a deed, crisply folded, stamped and signed. The property in question, just 2 blocks south of Gramercy Park, had been registered in her name. A narrow storefront with a second floor and tall front windows, once condemned for development, was now hers. Isadora traced her fingers over the embossed seal, her throat tight. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she rose slowly and wrapped herself in her cloak. Her boots were already by the door. She slipped them on, lit a small lantern, and stepped into the night. The snowfall had quieted the city, muffling the wheels, the hooves, the clang of bells. It was a city between eras, a city still lit by gas, yet dreaming of electricity, a city built by calloused hands and broken trusts. And as she walked, Isadora felt each step as if she were walking not toward a man, but toward the very bones of time. Gramercy Park was nearly deserted. Only a few passers-by moved along its gated edge, their silhouettes blurred by snowflakes and lantern smoke. The gate, tall and wrought iron, stood as sentinel to the dreams of the privileged. But tonight it was simply a frame, a stage for something unspoken. And there he was. Nathaniel stood beneath the old gaslight at the corner of the gate, leaning gently on his cane. He wore his long coat, the same one from the wedding, buttoned to the throat. A top hat rested on his head, though it had slipped slightly to one side. Snow had begun to gather on his shoulders, melting into the wool. His face, though pale, was calm, his eyes watching the snowfall rather than the clock. He did not speak as she approached. She stepped up beside him, her breath visible in the golden haze of the lamplight. Her gloved hands remained at her sides. For a long moment, they simply stood there, shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by the hush of falling snow and the distant sound of fireworks blooming like faded memories above the skyline. Isadora turned her face to him, studying the lines carved deeper by sorrow and time. He was thinner, yes, his jaw less firm, but his gaze, steady and full, no longer searched for redemption. It simply saw her. "You found it," he said finally, his voice low, barely louder than the wind. "I did," she replied. "I thought you might not come. I almost didn't." She turned toward the gate, toward the park behind it, where snow rested undisturbed on the benches and tree branches, as if winter itself were waiting for something to end. "Do you still sew?" he asked after a long pause. "I will," she answered. "Now I will." His lips curved, not quite a smile, but something softer. Then it was worth it. They stood in silence again. There were no declarations, no pleas, no apologies left to utter. The past between them remained, unvanished, a long tapestry of sorrow and longing, of guilt and forgiveness stitched into a single, unfinished seam. But it no longer weighed them down. It simply existed. Isadora reached into her pocket and withdrew a spool of silk thread, the same ivory thread she had once used on Constance's gown. She pressed it gently into his palm. "You gave me a place," she said. "I give you a piece of the story." Nathaniel held the thread in his weathered hand and closed his fingers around it. "Then we are even." "No," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "We are unfinished." As the bells of midnight rang from distant towers and the sky exploded into color above them, neither moved. The city erupted into a new century. Children cheering from windows, horns sounding from steamboats, champagne spilling in parlors, but the quiet between them held firmer than any celebration. They were not banker and seamstress, not ghost and widow, not the ruins of something lost. They were two souls, shaped by silence and scarred by time, meeting at the edge of a century and finding not passion, but peace. And in the spaces between their words, in the stillness of gloved fingers brushing, in the breath shared beneath the gaslight, their love was written, not loudly, not grandly, but truly. And at last, without farewell, they remained. The leaves had begun to turn. Along the avenues of the newly paved streets, the elms flared in amber and rust, their branches swaying like old memories caught in the wind. Carriages still passed, but now they shared the road with motor cars, loud and uncertain, puffing clouds of smoke as if surprised by their own invention. The city had changed. The air buzzed with electricity, and Gramercy Park had gaslights no longer. But the small atelier on Irving Place remained unchanged. Its windows, always clean, displayed fine garments sewn by steady hands. A modest sign above the door read simply, "Flynn Atelier." No initials, no grandeur, just a name stitched into the heart of the neighborhood. And behind that door, every afternoon before closing, one could find a woman with silver in her hair and softness in her eyes, bent over cloth and needle, humming forgotten lullabies. Isadora Flynn had not remarried. She had not moved, but her world had deepened. She now employed 3 young seamstresses, all orphaned girls, trained in the craft, with the same patience once given to her by the city's hardships. The sewing room rang with laughter some days, with music others. And every month, without fail, she made a new gown for a girl who could not afford one, a promise kept in silence. Behind the atelier, through a garden courtyard, stood a narrow brownstone. Nathaniel Greer lived there still. His cane rested by the door, now more necessity than formality. His hair had gone fully white, his steps were slower, and he no longer attended public events. But each morning he crossed the courtyard with a small parcel, tea, pastries, sometimes a bundle of violets, and left it on the sewing table before Isadora arrived. He never rang, he never knocked, but when she entered and saw the parcel, she always smiled, touched the ribbon, and continued her work. Some afternoons they walked together, slowly, sometimes through Gramercy Park, sometimes along the East River Promenade. They rarely spoke of the past, but sometimes, in quiet corners of autumn light, she would reach for his hand without thinking, and he always would take it. Constance had left New York. She had married, yes, though not the man her father once hoped for. Her husband was a writer, a dreamer with ink-stained fingers and little inheritance. They lived in Boston now. She visited twice a year, once alone, once with her 2 sons. At each visit, she placed a small bouquet at her mother's grave, then took tea with her father in silence. Her forgiveness was not loud, but it had arrived, steady as the tide. But not all debts faded quietly. One winter morning in 1901, Nathaniel's former business partner, the man who had once urged the tenement investments, who signed with haste and walked away with more than coin, was arrested in a scandal involving new construction across the river. The newspapers printed his name alongside Nathaniel's, though it was noted quietly that Mr. Greer had since donated his holdings to public housing and withdrawn from finance altogether. It was not vindication, but it was enough. Nathaniel never spoke of it, not even when asked. He spent his days reading, walking, and once a week teaching arithmetic at the children's home that bore Samuel Flynn's name. There were still days when he could not rise easily from bed, days when the winter air closed around his lungs and memories pressed too hard against his chest. But on those days, Isadora would arrive before breakfast. She would boil the water herself, measure the tea leaves, and sit beside him in silence. Sometimes she sewed, sometimes she read aloud, sometimes they simply watched the light fade together, hands resting in quiet proximity, hearts stitched together by something beyond time. They had not married, they did not call it love. But the city around them had learned to read the story anyway, in the care with which she folded his scarves, in the way he lingered at her door, in the letters neither sent but both kept. And though the world changed, though women now whispered about suffrage and airships passed overhead and electric trolleys replaced horses, there was something unchanged in their devotion. They had loved late, but they had loved well. And in the heart of a city that forgot everything too quickly, one small sewing shop and a man who had once ruled Wall Street lived quietly, remembered not in headlines, but in the hem of a silk dress, in the weight of a folded letter, and in the spaces between words where all true love lives. Even now, when the wind catches the edge of a shawl on Irving Place, when a child peers through a window and sees two figures walking arm in arm, when someone asks about the name on the atelier, a neighbor will answer, "That was her, and he never left her side again." And that somehow was enough. Sometimes love does not arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments, a hand held in silence, a letter never answered, a life rebuilt stitch by stitch. The Last Silk Dress is not just a story of romance, but of redemption, forgiveness, and the quiet power of second chances. Isadora and Nathaniel remind us that it's never too late to begin again. Not after grief, not after regret, not after years lost to silence. What matters most is not the past we carry, but the tenderness we choose to offer in the present. A love that endures the weight of time, that survives without being spoken, is a love that transforms. If this story moved you, tell us what touched your heart the most in the comments. And if you made it to the very end, write the word forgiveness in the comments, so we'll know you're part of the few who stayed until the final stitch. If you'd like to help keep stories like this alive, consider leaving a super thanks with whatever amount you feel comfortable sharing. Every contribution, big or small, helps our small team continue crafting these timeless narratives. And if now's not the time to give, you can still support us by sharing this video with someone who needs a beautiful story today. We've also selected more deeply emotional romances for you. Just click the cards on the screen and immerse yourself in another world of love, hope, and the strength of the human heart. Thank you for watching, and remember, some stories are sewn in silence, but their threads hold forever.